feminist groups are very divided about this movie, and I've been attacked by some feminist groups because basically a lot of the women who come out of the Women Against Porn movement tell me that I'm soft-pedaling prostitution. And those women are also saying that the women who work as prostitutes are automatically victims. But I found very much the opposite.
Hello, 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 and welcome to the 10th episode.
Little anniversary.
It is our anniversary, the 10th episode of Cannesversations. I'm Eliana, and I'm joined here.
Patrick, hi.
Hi, Patrick. So, you chose Working Girls. Would you like to talk a little bit about why you chose this film?
Yeah, I must admit I didn't know Lizzie Borden, the director, until a year ago or so when she came to Berlin. That is where I'm currently located. And she came for a few Q&As and screenings of her film. Yeah, she was a very enthusiastic, very generous person with her time and with the things she was willing to share. And one got a sense that she is really still fully engaged with these conversations that Working Girls and her other films like Born in Flames still bring to the table, and how they still feel fresh and feel like time hasn't gone on so far, which in a way is good and bad. And we might talk about that later. But yeah, I was really blown away by her two films that I saw last year, Working Girls and Born in Flames. Unfortunately, I didn't make it to see her first film that is more like experimental film, Regrouping, and that has apparently was picked up by Criterion, but so far it hasn't been released, and that is, I think, also for a reason that we might talk about as well later. But yeah, that is a film I really regret to have not seen. But yeah, I can just say I was so surprised how progressive, how early these films, if not made statements, then at least fueled the discussion on feminism and also just represented experiences and represented just ways of life that for 1986, which is when Working Girls was shot, and equally so Born in Flames in 1983, they would not have been imaginable to be screened in mainstream cinema. So yeah, Lizzie Borden, I think, such an interesting filmmaker, and I hope that, because she's still around and she's still looking to realize projects, and I just hope that there is more to come now in the future, that she, through the restorations of her work, becomes more popular again in culture in general.
Thanks to you, I only had heard of her work right after you had seen her films. And it's very, very interesting because she takes us into 1980s New York. I mean, the 80s, what a time to be living in, honestly. We have financial crisis of the 70s. We have the end of the Vietnam War. We have the early just events of what was happening. Let's say we have the first computer. We have in the 80s
Reagan America.
We have
Back to morals.
So 80s in New York, 80s in general. But before we get into the 80s, let's first start with Cannes in 1986. So in 1986, we have a selection of films that are premiering. I mean, Lizzie Borden's Working Girls was in the director's fortnight for the Quinzaine. At that time was réalisateur, but now it's cinéaste. And there are so many big names that appear whenever one thinks of film, independent film making or filmmakers. We have in competition that year Andrei Tarkovsky, The Sacrifice, Scorsese's After Hours.
Yeah, one of his few comedies. If you think of a Scorsese, you don't really think of After Hours, and I think that's a film that's not so much on people's radar, even now.
Jim Jarmusch's Down by Law.
Yeah, more like a cult classic these days, I think.
Robert Altman's Fool for Love.
Nagisa Oshima's Max Mon Amour. I have to say, I saw that lineup and I saw a lot of names, but I must say I barely saw any of these films that are there, and that is not really limited to the competition, but even the other sections in this year as well. So I can't really comment on the quality of that year, but I think there were a few standouts, like the Tchaikovsky. I think that's considered a masterpiece. And there were out of competition films that I think point at the differences to like how this section works nowadays, at least to some extent. I honestly feel like a film like The Color Purple by Spielberg, they would just have that in competition these days. I feel like they would not have that out of competition, even though arguably we have the Scorsese, but this is for different reasons. There was for marketing and how to promote that film. Yeah, I think Scorsese maybe also, I don't know if at this age he is still willing to compete in that competition. I don't know if he's up to that. I feel like this is a film that might just be scheduled in the competition these days. Out of competition, we also have films by Woody Allen and Roman Polanski that reminds us of Venice this year. We have Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger film, A Matter of Life and Death, that is now considered one of the best film of British cinema. So also strange to see that out of competition there. And we have Orson Welles. I guess we cannot say last film because there was, for instance, The Other Side of the Wind that was restored a few years ago and was finished. But this was then his last film, Don Quixote. And the screening that was shown at Cannes, there was only 45 minutes. And there were a lot of legal disputes about the rights of that film and about the film stock, like who has the rights for this film stock, who owns this later. There was really such a mess. The film we talk about today, Lizzie Borden's Working Girls, that played in the director's fortnight, so the Quinzaine back then, the réalisateur. And we have Chantal Akerman there with her musical comedy Golden 80s. That is also like the Scorsese, more like against type, like more like a counterintuitive title. We have the first Spike Lee movie, and that's interesting because Spike Lee's She's Gotta Have It, the camera he used, that was actually used later for Working Girls. So there was also this like passing on from one filmmaker to the other in New York back then. We have a film by Wojciech Haas, Memoirs of a Sinner, and I haven't seen that film, but I have read the book back then at college, and that's a very interesting book by James Hogg. It's like in the Gothic mood and in the Gothic context. It's very fun. But in the Un Certain Regard, we have the great Jane Campion show. So many films there. It's somewhat incredible there. And I think that has to do with her first recognition, basically, international, because these films were not all new, but they were screened for the first time as like a bigger audience. And I mean, she's from Australia or New Zealand? New Zealand, okay. Yeah, so you had to travel the globe basically to show your films back then.
Yeah, no, I think it's very lovely to see a few female directors in the competition. Well, not in in the selection in general.
Yeah,
in the pool.
Because I think again, there's no women in there's no woman in the competition.
Also, to even have Chantal Akerman, because I suppose there are some people who might have made an association between the film that we are discussing today and Chantal Akerman's her masterpiece, Jean Dillman, 23 Quai du Commerce, 1080 Bruxelles.
Yeah, okay.
This film.
No one will ever say that.
Jean Dillman, yeah.
Yeah. Which came out
in
which
75. So that's 11 years prior to Working Girls. And I think it also very much engaged in a type of cinema that might be considered, that is considered in slow cinema, that Lizzie Borden has also said was not something that she appreciated at the time, but has since grown to appreciate this work.
Right.
Because both of them deal with thematically sex work.
Yeah. The way I read it, I don't know, was more like that she didn't see the similarities to her work so much. No, because it's also a very, very slow movie, right? While Lizzie Borden's film is more in the vein of comedy, if dark comedy. But I mean, John Dillman is also a dark comedy, but it turns more to like drama than to comedy.
Yes.
Also, just when we think about speed, right? The tempo, the pace.
Yeah, and I think it's also very much an internal
exploration.
Yeah, an internal exploration and an internal empowerment, an internal rebellion that the character of Jeanne Dielman experiences versus the one. So when we even talk about working girls, we'll soon get into this, but just that it's not even really about prostitution as identity, but rather as a form of labor.
Right. Yeah, just to wrap the Cannes section up, I think we should mention the Palme d'Or winner. There was The Mission by Roland Joffe, and he's known for The Killing Fields that was released 2 years before, but the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And here The Mission, yeah, it's about missionaries. Yeah, reminded me just, if looking at the premise, reminded me of Scorsese's Silence. Yeah, but I think no one really talks about this film anymore. It's not in the discourse. So yeah, a Palme d'Or winner that was, if not forgotten, then at least it's not on people's radar these days anymore. And yeah, this was conferred, the prize was conferred by Sidney Pollack, who was the jury president of that year. We also have great filmmaker, Lino Brocca, Philip French, and this is interesting. So Philip French was a film critic and a friend of the show, Erku, who once was part of our show. She, I think, a few months ago or so, tweeted that it is a bit strange that these days film critics are not really part of juries anymore. So it's nice to see that there was, at a time, it was totally normal for film critics to be there as well. And I think it would also, if you just look at other film-related professions, right, like costume designers and all these people who are more like in the second or third row, if you think of recognition in the film world, I think it would be nice, not just for representation, but also to maybe provide us with different viewpoints and maybe don't make these juries always so predictable in that sense. We also have Sonia Braga, who 1 year before had her great film Kiss of the Spider-Woman, where she was the eponymous Spider-Woman, and István Szabó, the great Hungarian filmmaker who, among others, made Mephisto. But yeah, that was just to wrap the Cannes section up. Or do we have something else to say about this Cannes?
No.
Okay.
So it's lovely to see that there are some female filmmakers somehow getting to Cannes. Still much more to come about. I believe this past year, there were 3 or 4 female filmmakers who were in competition.
Right.
But let's talk about Lizzie Borden and her emergence. In some sense, she's a mythological woman because she shares the name with a late 19th century serial axe killer who is known for killing her father with the little rhyme, little ditty. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. And so it is said that she's born in the 1950s, the filmmaker that we're talking about, Lizzie Borden. However, it's a bit unclear whether some sources say 1958, some say 1950. However, it is known that she was born as Linda Elizabeth Borden in Detroit, Michigan. And around the age of 11, she decided to adopt the name Lizzie Borden because she felt that at the time, the best way that she could rebel was by changing her name. So Lizzie Borden she wanted to be an artist when she was young. She wanted to go to NYU, and she wound up going to one of the Seven Sisters schools in the States, Wesley College, and there she studied art history. She got a BFA in art history and was simultaneously trying to become a painter. But she found that it was very difficult for her to actually create and critique at the same time. And she says that in the back of her head, she always heard someone saying, but someone's already done this, someone's already done that. And this was quite influential on her own filmmaking process, as she refused to go to school to formally learn how to make films. But due to her art critic work, so she wrote in the 70s for Art Forum, and she still continues to write for Art Forum occasionally today on many of the emerging artists at the time. And this allowed her to just be in a form of community where you are not even community, but just, I suppose, near artists and those who are influential, such as Yvonne Rainer, Vito Acconci,
Susan Seidelman,
Betty Gordon, Nan Goldin, Catherine Bigelow, Richard Serra, etc. And these were all artists. I mean, contemporary art is technically, contemporary art is still contemporary art since the 1980s, which is about 45 years, almost 43 years ago. And
and perhaps, I think it's important what you say about her being an art critic, because that also sort of gives us a point of reference why her work is so self-reflective, right? We have this notion that all these scenes have been meticulously, that's fine. All these scenes have been meticulously developed, and they underwent a lot of rewriting on and on. And that's why sometimes you feel like, okay, this is not just facilitating your immersion into the scene, but it also makes you reflect on what enables such a scene to exist and how this works in the context of the time, of the political context. So I feel like it's never just, it's never just immersion. It's always also reflection, her filmmaking. And this is greatly to do with Jean-Luc Godard as well, right?
Yeah, I believe upon seeing Godard films, she realized that, you could have a story, but you could also be saying something on top of it. And this falls in the type of a film as essay and essay films category. And she was also very much influenced by these other, so Yvonne Rainer, contemporary dancer, who also made video installations, Vito Acconci, who often dealt with public and private spaces, as well as testing and displaying the vulnerability of men. Richard Serra, who would also challenge what it means to have a public sculpture or installation. But at this time period, we have a lot of people and a lot of discourse on what the body is, what public is, what private is, because of the economic situation. The whole entire world is changing and everything.
Yeah, and of course, second wave feminism as well.
And second wave feminism. So it was very influential for her to understand how video work could be implemented in a gallery space, which is not unlike what we spoke about in terms of Tsai Ming Liang in the previous episode. And so she took that and went on to, I suppose, we haven't talked about it, but you mentioned it earlier, but I guess progressively just regrouping, and in 76, which then, because due to the talents, they were not happy with their representation, was hidden from the public eye for about 40 years. And she cheekily says that it was literally in her closet.
It's sort of also a testament to how she conceives of filmmaking. It's very collaborative. I think you cannot deny her signature in these films. You can clearly tell, okay, this is a Lizzie Borden film, definitely. But I think the way she works is when it comes to the script, for instance, there's a script, but very much so like perhaps we talked about in one of our episodes, we talked about Valeska Griesebach. And here it works somewhat similarly, that the talent is really asked to contribute and to contribute ideas, and then you find something more on set. But for her, in any case, the most important part is the editing at the end.
Yes.
And the editing is also a fun story as well, right? Because in her New York loft, she had her own editing table. What is this particular one called again? Yeah, Steam Bag, exactly. Yeah. So she, as she often referred to, she had the means of production in her own hands.
Yes, and she would rent it out to all the other artists at the time, or filmmakers, or video installation artists who were making something for $25 for the day. And yeah, when you talk about this method of trying to collaborate together, I think she has drawn a difference between what she believes is inductive and deductive creation of a film. Deductive meaning having the script, and inductive, I suppose, the way that she sometimes works with the collaboration and of finding people. So for Born in Flames in 83, this sort of came about from another inductive sort of community. Like, she was thinking, okay, well, let me find and think of what is the type of society or that I would like to portray, and who would be leading that. And in her mind, it was very clear that it would be Black women, specifically Black lesbian women, who would be taking the lead in creating revolution. And she realized that she did not know any Black lesbians. And so she started to go to bars to meet them. And that's where she found eventually the revolutionary in her, the protagonist, Adelaide, who is, this is so bad. I don't have any of the actors' names, I realized.
But I guess that's also part of the point, not to, I mean, it's of course great to know the actors, but it's also part of the bigger concepts that no voice really stands out and no voice can represent the entire movement. Instead, it's sort of diversified, and you have all these different stratums. Maybe stratums is the wrong word because that goes from top to bottom, but you have all these different angles from which to look at feminism and to look at the contemporary politics. And it should also be noted, you said she didn't know any Black lesbian women, but I mean, she didn't know any Black woman, like period. And it's fun how in Born in Flames, there's this viewpoint that the women that more or less represent certain strands of Black feminism, they make fun of white upper class feminism as well in that film. Yeah, and perhaps about the process there as well, because I think
due to the collaborative script writing process, in fact, when we look at Born in Flames, we realize that there is no one who's attributed to having written the film Born in Flames, because she was taking from all of the different groups who are represented in the film. And actually, this caused a bit of a bureaucratic issue with the Writers Guild of America, when they insisted that she did not have a script for that film. So and she spent ages and ages and ages editing, because like you mentioned, she really enjoys the editing process. And then a couple of years later, when she decided to start working on Working Girls, she made sure that she actually had written a script, even though I believe there are still very much elements of collaboration that are involved. But it was tighter. And I don't know, but also it came from another source too, if you would like to talk about that. If that's
maybe before we go into that,
yeah.
This of course was necessitated by, financial hardship to some degree. So the reason why Born in Flames took so long was that she would film whenever she had money. So there would be a shoot just if new dollars came in, and there would be, much like we see it in Working Girls, the money would go directly into a creative project. So that's why it took 5 years, and that's also why, having gone through this sort of process, she felt that for Working Girls, she wants to do something more contained, that she can actually control, and that she has a stronger sense of beginning and end, and we see that maybe reflected in the structure of that film as well. Yeah, and Born in Flames itself, the film that sort of reflects this entire process too. It's about, different feminist movements that try to work together at a time that is set in the future, in a future where the democratic revolution has sort of taken place. It's a social democratic republic, but not so many things have changed for the better. So women are still sort of harassed on the street, and they don't have the same political rights and the same political representation. It's not really reflected in the law as well. And all these women from different fractions of society, they all try to find ways into making it a more democratic society. And instead of all sort of binding them together into one voice, Lizzie Borden rather in a sort of intersectional way, like avant la lettre, the term hasn't really coined.
Which was coined in 89, yeah.
Yeah. There one can see it was ahead of its time because it already considered all these different viewpoints that feminism, especially if we think about the 90s, early 2000s, was often accused of being oblivious to.
Yeah, I mean, second wave feminism really marginalized women of color and women who had different sexual orientations. And Borden Flames essentially tried to see all these differences and find a way to collectively speak to some empowerment that could be felt across all these groups, if possible. And I think what you say is absolutely correct in terms of we have this future after this socialist democratic revolution has occurred, but the future is not very unlike even perhaps arguably our present today. And that sometimes is the horror of imagining whatever the future is when the future is the same as what we have. And yes, in a way, she also has said this thing about this film that even though it emerged from this collaborative without a script process, it has in some sense a 3-act structure, and it's unified by the death, potential suicide or murder of the most revolutionary of the leaders, and that becomes the catalyst which unites the front as they go and they try to conquer the phallic symbols of capitalism.
Right. And the revolution is transmitted via radio here.
Yes. Yeah, and that was really lovely to see. And just because I think it's so wonderful, before we move on, I just wanted to say that one line that I really liked is when early in the film, the revolutionary Adelaide is trying to get the Phoenix radio host, Honey, on board. And Honey says, I'd like to say yes, but I'm working with some other woman right now, and I wouldn't want to commit myself for them. So maybe we can talk some other time, okay? And I think this is just such a lovely way of showing that you are in solidarity with a cause, but you cannot commit. It's just the loveliest, not rejection, hard off, but just still
because
an openness
in a way,
about it.
They're all working on the same thing, but in different projects, right? And this is maybe more to the notion of, like, as people conceive of multiculturalism, that you allow each culture to exist in themselves, but together they all can form something that doesn't annihilate or that doesn't take away from that individual standpoint, from that individual perspective. I like that too very much, that aspect of it. From there, one way of talking about a transition from the one project to the other, I talked about this desire to make something that is more self-contained in Lizzie Borden. So she actively sought that out. But also there's one shot in Born in Flames that is penis that condom is rolled onto, and Lizzie Borden claims that this is one of the initial moments for the idea of Working Girls, because the way she intercuts this one scene with other scenes is that it is in the context of labor. It's about like everyday life. And this is very much the subject of Working Girls. Maybe one or two more things about this context in which all this emerged. You already talked about the community, the artistic community back then.
It was highly fractured. in a sense too. I mean, everyone's
Exactly.
doing their own thing. You have Keith Haring starting graffiti on the subways. You have
That's exactly the spirit, but it was also collaborative. So even though people were not all involved with one project at the time, but many different, they would help out each other and they would all sort of, if remotely, they would all know each other. And many of these people were associated with the no wave movement. There was sort of, as you can infer from the name, sort of a counterculture to the new wave back then, so a less commercial approach to art and culture, perhaps. And they all often met in the Mud Club that was located in Tribeca, because when we talk about the second wave feminism, I think it's important to mention Shulamith Firestone, who's The Dialectic of Sex in 1970 is benchmark, a milestone for the feminist movement. And also when it comes to context, the aspect of gentrification, right? That New York especially the Lower East Side at that time.
Yeah, following the financial crisis in the 70s, the emergence of crack cocaine, which was just substances very addictive and at the same time
cheaper, of course.
And cheaper, and was circulated. And we have also this idea of the sexual revolution, which is very difficult to talk about within this context. Branching off from second wave feminism, we had the sex wars, which were certain women who were pro pornography and then the women who were against pornography.
Yeah, that's very important.
Because they believe that it was tied into degrading traditional values of the woman in the domestic sphere, the women that had fought for first and second wave feminism, essentially, and that it would lead to an increase in violence. And this violence was in some ways present because there was a very high crime rate, but it's not right to associate those two together.
Yeah, but it's also interesting how this sort of, I think even these feminists, many of them that were against porn and against prostitution would not have voted for Reagan, for instance, but by antagonizing sex workers and porn actors and so on, they sort of subscribed to the Reagan idea of new morals.
I think it was New York too was filled with sex shops and prostitution, and during this time of the sexual revolution, AIDS had just been identified, HIV had also been identified. And in this whole entire confusion, I don't want to defend anyone here, but just that it was a time of crime and violence and disease that seemed to be spreading from sexual contact, and thus very slippery and easy slope that I think a lot of people took to just simply go, oh, sex is bad. And this, of course, luckily now, 40 years later, we're able to, through technology and science, medical advancement, able to sort of distance this. But the moral idea still remains. I mean, it comes from religion, but of course we have prostitution is known as the oldest profession in the world. So perhaps, honestly, prostitution probably foredates religion in some sense.
It is muddled subject.
It is a very muddled subject.
Yeah, so back to Working Girls, or first we really enter Working Girls now. As I said, we have this transition from this shot in Born in Flames, the condom that is rolled onto the penis, and then we are now really inside a depiction of the labor that is involved on daily basis of pursuing this job. What is Working Girls? It's a depiction of middle-class brothel in New York. The film is really primarily set inside. We have 3 locations, I would say. We have the apartment of our protagonist, Molly, but the apartment we see maybe for 2 or 3 minutes in the entire film. Then we see her biking to her job. And this biking, I thought back to Born in Flames, where we have the bike brigade that would come up whenever a woman would be harassed on the street. And then the female bike brigade would come up and whistle at the perpetrator to make him go. And yeah, after a short bike ride, we are again in domestic environment. And this I found very peculiar. Just this domestic environment now is the brothel, but it looks really like a loft. And why does it look like a loft? Because it was Lizzie Borden's loft at the time. So she used her own apartment and sort of made some arrangements so it looks like something that would be used by professionals. Yeah,
I
by
think
professional sex workers.
I think a set, I mean, maybe in its loose understanding of what a set is, was created for this from her loft. And so there were some moving walls. And of course, I suppose she made some areas look more accommodating, I think, of the drink station and then the collective couch area where we have a division of the upstairs and the downstairs.
Exactly.
Downstairs, they don't talk about prices. Upstairs, they talk about prices and bring the clients there. And there's also a separation between what happens upstairs and what happens downstairs, what is discussed as well.
Yeah, that's good. And it all has more like the air of an office, right? With the phone constantly ringing there as well.
Yes. And someone who has to be present
exactly
to receive these calls.
And perhaps, do you want to talk about, because that is something that you found in your research that I didn't find about Lizzie Borden, Lizzie Borden and her own connection to the story, because I mentioned the apartment of our protagonist, Molly. Molly is like former Yale student. She graduated much like Lizzie Borden in art history, and for her, I think it's literature as well. And could you talk about the connection there?
It's quite interesting. In a little bit of research that we found, it was exactly as you said, that this often when Lizzie Borden talks about why the idea for working girls emerged, she sort of states that had come to her attention that there were many women who were doing the sort of middle class apartment prostitution. There is also an additional interview done by another gaze, in which she says that Working Girls was also somewhat a true story, and it was a story for her. And the opening sequence where we see a white woman, what we see Molly in bed with a black woman who is her partner, that was her and Honey, she has said in one interview. I do understand in ways why she wouldn't necessarily go around repeating that this is the origin, but I do find that that's quite lovely, since she often does say to emerging filmmakers, because she's a very loving presence and a very encouraging woman in general.
Positive.
And very positive, very optimistic in a sense. And
which, given her career trajectory, is all but self-evident, right? That she would still be so, upright.
Yes. And she often just encourages filmmakers to look at their own selves, at their own stories, to see what they can bring up at their own lives and reflections.
But do you think that this is part of the reason why she doesn't do that so often? So the film is not just, known as her story?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that that is also for the better, because what she does in Working Girls, we have one day in the life of a woman who does this sort of work. And I think it's an amalgamation and a type of, it's not a judgmental one, but it's sort of an anthropological look at, these are all the types of clients that come in. These are the types of other women who work there that you will encounter. And these are the tasks that were given. And this is the madame. And the madame is the one who is going to ruin it all, but also presents that power dynamic, which ultimately validates the work as work, but also brings into another level of what it like the economics and the labor side of what it means to actually be doing such work with such a boss that's quite unpleasant, and that this too is a reality. And the boss, Lucy, is not unlike any other bosses, but I think we'll talk about that a little bit later, perhaps. Essentially, Lizzie Borden has once said that one of the nicest receptions of her work that she got was when a man came up to her after a showing of Working Girls and said, "I used to have a boss just like that."
Yeah, yeah.
And
Yeah, and
yes.
this sort of is a testament to the film not depicting so much prostitution or sex work, but just a capitalist system, right? And how this works. Yeah, with Lucy being really like a neoliberal boss that
Mhm.
purportedly just wants the best for all her workers, but of course she is the one who has the surplus value. She
Oh my goodness.
she can,
Yes.
it's all given to her basically, and she owns the means of production that is apart from the bodies of the females. That's also just the apartment there and the location. And
Yeah. If you want to talk more about this right now, but I find that even her character is also viewed in a way that everything is seen as part of a larger system of how this might work. And I find that that contributes to the characters both having dimension and also feeling slightly flat, as if they could be any type of worker in such a system, but at the same time that they also are neither victim, but that they are victim and perpetrator of that very
right,
system and thus Lucy, when they talk about Lucy, it's almost as if when they're talking about in a theater play, the character that you're always waiting for to arrive. The girls, there are three of them. They wonder, where is she? Where is she? Where is she? Oh, she used to do work. She used to do this type of work as well, but she hasn't done it in a while. Now she just owns a couple of places and she has her boyfriend. And then we learn that her boyfriend she's really the mistress to her boyfriend.
exactly. So he's
Um,
married, and
and
yeah, in a sense, you could even argue that when we think about hierarchy here, he is at the very top of it because she is dependent on him as well. Not so much when it comes to, I don't know, like income, but she wants all these things from him as well. She wants to have affection expressed through gifts and money.
and this is played out comedically
Yeah.
as well, as if almost to, I don't know, soft address it, because I do think we're not to think that this character should really resonate with us, the audience, but to show that even though she only likes two things in life, money and sex, and realize that those two things could be tied together, that she too perhaps lacked something that she's not getting. And I think there is that sense that each one of these women also has something that they want, that their job allows them or enables them to get simply by the fact that it's money that they're going to be getting in order to get closer to whatever it is that they desire.
Mm. Yeah, and maybe just talking about how this project came to life as well, we should say that this is a very low budget film, as you might expect. It's about $200,000. It's set at some, in some sources it's said to be less, like 100,000, 110,000. But I think at some point the production wasn't quite finished yet and she needed more money, so it amounted in total to 200,000, which still, of course, was not a lot. At the time, it didn't have a lot of like explicit nudity there, but it was enough to give it an no rating, like an X rating, I think it's called. And which is also a shame because I think Lizzie Borden cut out certain scenes to get better rating for this film, but it was still apparently too juicy for what is the association of like what is this association? But in any case, it was X-rated, and so this is a film that, as we said, played at Cannes at the Cannes and was picked up by Miramax, and Miramax, we all know, is the production company of Harvey Weinstein. But back then, he wasn't the big name that he would become, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. Back then, this was one of the first, yeah, I don't know if we can talk of a financial success, but it was at least received well, that this film was picked up and it had a sort of run through different festivals afterwards. It played at Sundance next year in 1987. And for us, I think we might talk about later about Harvey Weinstein, because if we talk about her later career, I think that will be important. But for us, it is most important now that this was restored, the film Working Girls, in 2021 by Criterion, and I think with the aid of UCLA, and yeah, was bought as a sort of three package deal. So, and it's interesting to see that it is sometimes said that those are her three films, regrouping Born in Flames and Working Girls. There is at least one more film, but this is left out because then she tried to be part of the studio system. But we will talk about that later.
I love most in life are sex and money. It's just that I didn't know until much later that they were connected.
So yeah, back to Working Girls. So we have the premise. We talked about the premise. And yeah, we just follow Molly now in the brothel throughout the course of the day. It's just one day, and the day starts out to be just one shift, but she's talked into by Lucy, more or less forced into a double shift. And this also makes us reflect perhaps the structure of the film, that the first half is more lightly comedic and the second half turns a bit darker, which is also accentuated through the lighting of the film, but just inherently in the scenes as well that become more grim, that become, because the Johns, and to me that's a new term, and we have to talk about language as well. The Johns, so the clients, they are more like dummies, In the first half, they are a bit like naive guys. They are like almost just goofy, goofy guys, often like old as well, like above 50 often, I would say, and they have this sort of weird, like almost avuncular relationship when they talk with the girls, and they all secretively make fun of them, when they are not around. And
the nicknames are very funny.
Yeah, the nicknames are funny. But in this first half, it's all more or less fun. And in the second half, we also see very much the downsides of the profession as well, to a larger or lesser extent that is up to debate. But there is definitely a shift in tone, I think.
Yeah, I would say the first half is a bit lighter too, but there's also the sense that, the three women are together, they're asking where Lucy is, and they're talking a little bit about what they've been up to, what it is that they want to do, what they're trying to achieve. We learn that Dawn is it Dawn or is it?
Perhaps. Dawn is doing what?
I think is trying to, is in school, and she's trying to get an essay done. We learn.
I love Dawn,
Yes.
because Dawn brings always the comedy in there. She's more like, how can you describe her?
She brings comedy, and she brings this youthful attitude that's a bit rebellious, but is that of a woman who is, we get the sense that she's there for the money like anyone else. Who knows why she's going through school? Maybe she's she's had some maybe issues going through school, and thus she needs a little bit of extra help, but she's very honest and she knows what she does and doesn't want. There's a slightly
very blunt, right?
Very blunt, yes.
Yeah, and also cartoonish.
Yeah.
Cartoonish, and we later learn also that she worked the street at some point, and I think this is important because in the manner of Born in Flames, where Lizzie Borden tries to represent all these different fractions, here as well we see different trajectories that lead into this middle-class brothel.
And I was going to say something, but I forgot.
Maybe about the other girls? I don't know. Dawn?
Yes, and I think Dawn is also one of the first, perhaps to say, while they're all together and we hear that Fantasy Fred is going to be arriving, or whoever it is, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Someone is arriving first.
Yeah.
And I think she just essentially says, oh, I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
work. I don't want to have sex with them right now, or I don't want to do this.
Yeah, and I think these sort of comments also are used in the script as an interruption, because otherwise it might seem like more like class trip or something, at least in the first part, where we feel like if they are among themselves, so like if the women are among themselves, they have a lovely attitude toward each other. They are very warm and they share jokes and they share food as well. I think the food scene, especially when they share lunch together, it almost seems like just friends, just friends who hang out. I think they also pass around a joint at some point as well.
Yes, and then they get in trouble for smoking.
Exactly, yeah.
And yeah, there's some insights into their personal lives as well, and the emotional tribulations that they have. Of the three women, Molly is in a relationship with a woman at home, which we've discussed. Dawn is in a relationship for 5 years with a boyfriend who is not aware that she also does this type of line of work. And in fact, that's actually how she enters, by saying that she lied about the address because her boyfriend insisted on dropping her off. And this sort of throws her into a bit of a frenzy.
Oh, but that's so good, because I think this film really immerses you into that, even though we don't see that scene play out. But she says, so she has to go into that building, in this office building, to pretend working there, and then this boyfriend wouldn't go, so she's sort of trapped in there. And I find it interesting how even there you have this entrapment of women to the inside, right? She has to wait until he drives off to then return to her actual workplace that he doesn't know about.
Yeah, and in a different sense of entrapment, we have Gina, too, who has always been upfront with the type of work she does with her partner. However, in this idea of, well, if he loves me, then he should be able to accept the fact that I do this line of work. And this comes crumbling to a bit of an emotional moment too, where it seems that she is no longer with her partner as well, but it's all done in a very sort of rapid sense. And then we learn that Molly has not revealed to her partner that she is doing that sort of work because she knows that it would probably affect their relationship.
Yeah, and I think this film also makes you think about what this so-called faithfulness is, right? Because Dawn claims that in these 5 years that she's been with her boyfriend, she has never been unfaithful. And I think this is so great that this is a part of this. Of course, the boyfriend might think of it differently, but it makes you consider how you can look at this work, right? And I'm sure we find a lot of people sympathetic to that notion, right? That you can totally divide this sort of
love and sex or desire between those two as well, or even just a division perhaps of actions.
Yeah.
Whether this is considered cheating, whether that is considered cheating. And
yeah, I think I talked about immersion a few times, and I think what I found most impressive with regard to this film, it's only 90 minutes long, about 90 minutes long, but it's so dense and it's so packed with scenes that often work at least on two levels. We have the story, but we also have the aspects that point to society as a whole and that point to the zeitgeist time. So one of the very early scenes in the apartment, like in the brothel, in the loft, is it Molly who inserts a diaphragm?
Yes.
Yeah. And this was actually a scene that was opposed by the Motion Picture Association of America. So
the rating system.
They didn't want that in there. And it familiarizes you early on with the sort of philosophy or the stance of, or at least one of the stances of the film, because when confront, like, first of all, we see how these women interact, right? Like, it's like another woman, I don't know who it is, but another woman comes in, sees her doing that, and they are comfortable with each other. It's not like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going. No. It's like she stays around and they chat a bit, and they talk about why they are doing it. Why isn't she just taking the pill? And she says that she doesn't want to fuck up her hormones for like two
shifts a week.
2 shifts a week, exactly. And
well, I think just shows the logistic aspect of what is needed on the job in terms of this is a job and thus should be treated professionally as one. And in order to professionally ensure the integrity of one's body, one's hygiene, if you're a woman, I mean, we have contraceptive methods that emerged early on, but they're not very reliable. So even the diaphragm itself is not the most reliable contraceptive method. And that's also just to prevent pregnancy, primarily. It doesn't necessarily prevent you from getting other diseases.
Yeah, and to me, that's part of what makes the scene so strong, is that it is not a very reliable contraception. So her doing that, first of all, I think often, tell me if I'm wrong, but it's better to have medical assistance doing that, no? To have it inserted correctly?
No. So the diaphragm is actually a device that can be inserted before sex, in the same way that now we have something that's similar, a menstrual cup or a menstrual disc that has been invented, which works in a different sense now. But I believe then they were not very comfortable. They were probably much more rigid and often they'd be inserted with a cream called nonoxynol 9 that would be a spermicide, which would kill the sperm, essentially. But you're absolutely right. It's not protective on other levels for...
Yeah, and in any case, it is not inserted correctly, then it doesn't work.
Yes.
So doing that, Molly doing that, also points at the precarity of this, right? Of this entire undertaking. That if she is doing a mistake here, then it will cost her immensely, especially at the time.
Especially because we also find out over the course of the day that some Johns wear condoms and some do not. If they don't want to wear a condom, they pay an extra $25. And this seems like such a small fee for such a big risk on behalf of women's body. And we do have other episodes of this. We have this of just speaking, because we're continue on the logistics of what needs to be done for health and hygiene. There is a bit of a routine every time they come in that starts with the almost seductive opening icebreaker of, can I get you a drink? To once the John has decided to stay and that he would like to pick a woman, they go upstairs and they are told, or it is taught, that they hand them a towel and they say, please make yourself completely comfortable. And logistically, this poses a bit of as a nuisance because some Johns don't always get fully naked after they're told to make themselves fully comfortable. And others also not even that keen on hygiene.
But there's also, do you know what that function is as well of that phrase? Make yourself comfortable. Do you know what purpose that serves as well?
Oh, tell me.
It's to identify police officers. When they don't get undressed, then you might be suspicious of them.
That's actually quite...
Yeah. So that's part of the method here as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't know that. That's quite cool. That's not the right word to use.
But it's good that this is part of the film, right?
Yeah, it's good that that's part of the film. It didn't occur in the film in this way, but that's interesting.
Yeah, I think there's probably still or a few things in there that you don't actually recognize and I guess we both have no exposure really to that world. There might still be certain codes or something that we are not able to identify, like this one, right? That might easily slip through.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, there are if you wanted to go through some of the other phrases that were used that are just little language. I mean, we have do Greek.
Oh, yeah.
Which is anal.
which, like looking at it in the knowledge of it seems so obvious, but I had no idea what that means, so I had to look it up.
I mean, do you want to do Greek? The fact that it becomes a type of euphemism, even though it's very maybe clear, because going back to Greek antiquity and...
Yeah. But next to language, we will find a few more things, but also when it comes to this immersion part and this like everyday life routine, I liked, for instance, that Borden and her talent made it a point to get a bit unnerved about hickey, right? Like if there's a hickey, of course, that takes away from your chances of getting, it's not a gig, but, being chosen by the man, which in itself is also something we should talk about, right? It's almost like a casting that's going on there. Like once the John enters, most of the time, he finds 2 to 4 women or so hanging around, often 3. Then he's to pick one of them.
I honestly thought if this were an evening party, Lucy, when she does arrive, does such a lovely job actually introducing everyone. And it would be lovely, actually, if you go to any party, someone just like, oh, hi, have you met Patrick? Oh, have you met Eliana? This is a one-liner of what they do. And so then we have this selection process that goes on based off of this one-liner. And sometimes on 2 or 3 instances, we have Johns that come in who are known for always taking the new girls. So we have the arrival of 2 new girls.
One black woman might not be new to the profession, but new in that brothel in any case. And there is one woman who seems to be quite new to the entire profession.
Yes.
And doesn't know the codes, doesn't know how to behave in the situation, feels uncomfortable. One of the scenes that really stands out, and it's such a small detail, but it shows you something about Molly as the character and also about the complexities that might occur at such a workplace. That is, at some point, one of the Johns doesn't want only this new woman that, we don't know the name of right now, but this woman who's new to the profession. And he wants a show. Exactly. So he gets them 2 up to his bed, and the other woman feels uncomfortable and says...
Right, we see them preparing in the bathroom when they have a moment alone.
And she says something like, I've always been afraid of dykes, with Molly next to her. But Molly, we don't even see a reaction like she's upset.
We don't even see her face. I think we only see her hand, or maybe I'm mistaken.
I don't know, but she immediately responds with, hey, do I look like a dyke?
Yeah.
And it's great because this shows us the complexity of Molly, that she can sort of abstract from this insult. She is able to see that society is not ideal, and there is resentment in society, and there are a lot of phobias of different kinds, and she can sort of deal with that. And I think that adds much to her character. Yep, perhaps should we talk about the relationship between the working girls and the Johns? That there is this sort of emotional labor as well that is often, I think, unnoticed and unrecognized, but the film makes a point to highlight that. For instance, we see how the working girls have different tendencies, how to deal with the Johns, and how much they are willing to share with them in emotional respects, how much they interact, not only physically, but also, verbally. There's, for instance, Molly, who's fine with kissing the Johns and share about their life as well. And I think what's interesting there is there's this one man, for instance, where you can clearly see that for him, this means much more than just, sexual release, but he actually looks forward to these occasions so he can talk about his life to her, and maybe more so than to family or friends.
There are a few of those. I don't know which one you're actually particularly talking about, but I do find that a lot of the Johns do sense that there is an emotional connection with Molly, because we primarily see customers, the clientele that she sees over the others, but we do get a glimpse into how the others also intake their clients.
Yeah, and this one business guy, he says, it is implied that he had some business success. It is stated, I guess. And he says, what better person to share it with? And I think this tells you something about what importance these women play, but not so much sexually, but rather as a person to confide in or as a person to have this relationship in. And then this is sort of not recognized when you talk like perhaps in the pay, in the money they make, like you only talk about this sort of transaction, but you don't take into account these other factors that also make for the entire experience of being with a working girl.
Yeah, and I think this is also the same in any work setting in some sense.
Of course,
too.
yeah.
But yes, of course, your salary or your hourly rate or whatever it is that you're getting to be with a client of any kind is never reflective of however much the emotional weight of the job or the emotional weight that is imposed upon you. Because we do have many of these Johns who come in and for a range of different reasons seem to want to connect with her. There are a couple of them who propose seeing her outside of this place, being the apartment. And there are a few who most of them actually, I think, seem to desire more. We have a slightly affectionate, but also slightly on the borderline of affectionate and just a bit deranged, essentially. But Molly receives a shirt from a client and she says, well, would you look at that? Last week I told him, I complimented him and I said I liked his shirt and now he's giving it to me.
That's very
but
funny,
then
yeah.
later on, it does seem like this same John is asking her for dating advice and getting advice on how he should possibly seduce someone in his life that he's interested in. Things are not strictly played out to really make someone seem like a bad person or a bad client, but we also have this happen with this experimental musician who comes in and presents one of the most maybe seductive instances that we see in of our clients. He's younger, he is edgier, and he talks about how he was away but was thinking about her and wants to take her away. But then he also, in some ways, is one of the worst types because he's rather a brute.
Certainly the worst, right?
And he talks about desiring her outside and what that would be like. And
this is very much like this pattern we note from nowadays. Like it's often shared on social media. Like the man makes the approach to a woman. And if there's rejection, I never wanted you, you ...
Yeah.
I never want you dirty, blah, blah, blah. And this guy basically reacts in the same way, right? And this sort of pattern, it's already there in 1986, surely much before there as well.
And this scene, is it not that actually drives her to...
Exactly,
to tears.
Exactly. The first time really that we see her actually affected. Because the turn also comes, like the shift comes so sudden, right?
In a sense, it is towards the end of the film, and I believe she's already been asked to do extra work.
Oh, I mean, but
you mean...
with this encounter, like in the one moment, this person is like, I really want to see you outside, and then...
And we have the sense, as if we're tricked too, that perhaps because we know that she's not closed off to, like we said earlier, that she kisses some of the Johns, and there's even a comment made by her colleague to say, I don't know how you stand kissing them or how you can even do that. And Molly just retorts earlier in the film, oh, they're not all that bad. I kiss the ones that I trust, or something similar to that, because I'm very bad at verbatim. But
so even there are like gradations, right? There's no equal treatment or something. Many other things that I would like to talk about. I think we didn't mention when we talk about all these girls. I think we didn't quite mention yet that they all have different aspirations. There's this one scene when they talk about what plans they have for the future. And this is, as far as I can tell, not for most of them, it's not a profession that they want to be part of all their life. It's rather like momentary. And for instance, Molly, our protagonist, what does she pursue? What kind of career?
Photography. We see that in the opening sequence. It's part of her daily routine. She wakes up. I mean, I thought that this opening sequence alone was actually very well, beautifully filmed by Judy Irola, who's also was known for doing the cinematography for many activist films around that period. And just get the sense of how the domestic sphere is so tight and connected with a simple mirror in the bathroom and the opening of doors in the hallway and the routine of eating breakfast in a family of 3. And Molly just spends a moment in the morning developing some of her own photography.
Whose photos are they? Nan Golden. Yeah.
Oh, really? I
Yeah.
actually didn't.
Those are
Okay.
Nan Golden's photos that she provided Lizzie Borden with for the film.
That's sort of lovely. Of course, Nan Golden has always been an activist.
If you listen to this podcast, if you are so deep into film that you know that, but Nan Golden had a documentary about her last year in Venice.
Right. All the Beauty and the Bloodshed.
Yeah, by Laura Poitras.
Who did Citizen 4.
Exactly. So Nan Golden, also to just people who only follow cinema, might still be familiar with that name.
Yeah, and it's New York, 70s,
Yeah.
80s, as we spoke of earlier, HIV/AIDS epidemic, drug crisis, and the opiates basically taking down the Sackler name and the residual pain, because Nan Golden hung around a lot of artists at the time and is
Betty Gordon
very
as well, for instance.
instrumental in photographing the scene, the zeitgeist of the 80s, and was active then and is active now in terms of fighting for the rights of women and fighting against these large corporations. It's very depressing, but many of her friends passed away for a variety of different reasons that are either drug or virus-related complications.
There are one or two things I still want to talk about that are important to me is this exploitative environment that this brothel is, right? We talked about Lucy, but for instance, very early on, Dawn, one of the girls, Dawn, we talked about her, she complains out loud that sometimes she barely makes more money than a waiter would do. And that, of course, puts this entire endeavor into question, right? You do that, and for some women, that means a great deal of degradation. Not to all of them, and this is part of the film, of course, but to some it definitely does, and some are disgusted by this and do it nonetheless, and don't do more than a waiter, then of course, why are you doing this, right? And this is partly to do with Lucy and how she is always taking her share with all the Johns, all the customers, all the clients. And yeah, I think a great motif of the film is the notebook of Molly, where she writes down all the clients, and she has 2 columns of her table. The one that she tells Lucy she has seen, and then she has her other column where she inserts actually the extra hours that she doesn't talk about with Lucy. So she makes some extra money at the side. For instance, Johns can go in for an hour, but she would often claim that they only stayed half an hour, so she can take the extra money to herself. And all the women there are doing that.
You said the motif of the notebook, but then it's the motif of also, I suppose, them throughout the whole entire film that they are tabulating, in a different sense of just put down this, just put down that.
The reason why I said it is a motif is because it works sort of as a reminder that this is a transaction, that this is work, and that points to Molly as being like the agent of her own life, and to remind her why she's doing it, it's the money. So she can invest that again into her art. So I think it works sort of as a motif, it's a recurring shot of her, inserting the numbers into her notebook.
And this is also keeping in mind, I don't know if you made a direct connection to this, but that these women, we talked about the depiction of the logistics of putting in diaphragm and wearing condoms, but the money to pay for those things also comes out of their own pocket. And there's a scene which, in a way, it's comedic, but it's also sort of tragic because reflects the reality. But Molly makes a stop to the pharmacy where she has a list of things to get because she's asked all the other women if they need anything. And so she buys a lot of boxes of condoms. She fills out a prescription for someone's birth control, and she gets other things and then delivers them. And the pharmacist essentially says, "Oh, you don't take any chances, do you?" And then we have her leaving, and we have, for the first time that she's left, we have another scene. She's just watching people on the playground, which I thought was actually very grounding and insertion in the film. And we see Black women taking care of white children on the playground as if to present an alternative of domestic labor and just a different economy of labor or a service of labor in general. There were a few other things that would have been very interesting to talk about because you mentioned just now in terms of Molly's agency. So the two ways that I see this is, we haven't talked about this at all, and I think it's quite confusing to talk about, but we have also as considerations in terms of filmmaking, but how to depict a woman, male gaze, female gaze.
Right, of course.
These ideas of, we have nudity, and nudity was very important for Lizzie Borden to include because of the nature of the work. It's to be revealing, but not to be exoticized or to sexualize, hypersexualize in the way that many other films that were blockbuster or Hollywood based were doing at the time with the bodies of women. And I do even think that some form of association was put together to sort of question, how do we not sexualize a female body? And that even might include, from the Criterion chat with Betty Gordon and Liz Borden, revealed that some even suggest that the woman be depicted from head to toe so that no fragmented or just close-ups be shown. And we do have that. I think Lizzie Borden is actually against the idea because she finds that there's a purpose for showing body parts as just body parts. But I do find that in this, I never really got the sense as well that this was exploitative in terms of the body of Molly. But back to the question of agency, I'm sorry to be jumping around.
Oh, no, but maybe talking about this, I earlier mentioned that there was a scene that there were a few scenes that were deleted for the rating. And one of the scenes she really wanted to have in there was an ejaculation. And that was cut out of the film, a hand job. We see the result maybe later, but we don't see the actual, ejaculation. And she really wanted to have that in there because this masculine vulnerability is something that she wanted to have displayed in her films as well.
That's very interesting to me because I think I read a critique of Working Girls, which essentially was contemplating on the fact that there are no so-called money shots, which colloquially are used just to denote an ejaculation scene. And they found that this was even maybe more empowering in a sense because we don't see male pleasure as a depicted male pleasure. So it's interesting to know that she really wanted to see it and would probably put it in a different framework and through her editing as a moment perhaps of male vulnerability. So back to the agency question, which kind of might help us wrap up a little bit here. Over the course of a day, Molly sees, I don't even know, I didn't keep count at all. I didn't even try, but she sees a number of clients and she's asked to stay over. She's even lied to when she tries to tell her employer that she cannot do that she doesn't want to do that. And her employer tells her that she's called some other girls. They'll come and relieve Molly. And then at the end of the double shift that she has, Molly then leaves. And it's highly implied that she is quitting entirely this line of work. And so before we wrap up, let's look a little bit at perhaps race. You had a few things that you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, because overall I'm so positive on the film that I don't want certain things to fall off here that I think merit mention as well. There's one point I want to critique here, that is the Asian representation, because there are at some point these three dons, and I think are Chinese.
Yeah, they speak actually Mandarin and Cantonese, which is not, their translation of what they're saying is not present in subtitles.
Yeah, and this sort of makes them the alien there. Yeah, they are the others. And this translates to what happens then upstairs. There's this one man of them, and he refuses to take a shower, even though he's urgently asked by Molly again and again if he could shower. And I think then, isn't it that he also doesn't want to wear a condom?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think he doesn't want to wear a condom. And what happens is we see how Molly interacts with him based off of this. So he refuses to wear a condom, and well, she refuses to mount him and winds up giving him a hand job.
Yeah, and in like the American film history, you have had that for a long time, that Asians or Asian Americans, they were often silenced, or they were limited to this sort of, this tongue that is, that is often not even of the actor, but the actor had to play as if they were not fluent in English, or if they had problems with English, they had to put on a certain dialect or accent. And I think sort of this film unfortunately plays into that a bit. So they don't really get to speak much. And yeah, they seem to be the alien here. And if as if they belong to a different culture, as if they couldn't understand the concept of hygiene and the concept of showering. And I found that to be unfortunate, because those are the only three Asian people. I think I remember Lizzie Borden talking about the sort of lack of Asian representation in her film, also when I saw her Q&A in Berlin. And yeah, also saw there was a conversation on the Criterion channel among I think the actors and the producers. I think primarily the actors, and one of them also said that she was uncomfortable with that scene seeing again. Yeah, and I felt the same even before I saw that. So yeah, I think that is not great. How did you feel about that?
Yeah, I can understand how this sort of a scene hasn't really aged well. I did also see something too related, but perhaps it was more directly related to Born in Flames, but it's still related in general in terms of Lizzie Borden's agenda to try to have a very diverse representation across race, at least. And I think perhaps too, she, now we can only say that it's also in terms of transgender, non-binary. These are not present in these two films, but they're very much present in our current life and world. But that she had said it was difficult to find people who are of different races, and she had attributed that to the language barrier in one interview, particularly with regards to Asians and Latinos. I did see that she has expressed regret and said, I would do it differently this time. Overall, I do think there are some scenes that are maybe, there is one John who implied that he might be from Africa, named Brandy Bongo by the other working girls, and he comes more than once to the brothel, and it's implied that he has, that he's over sexualized, and he is actually, well, he's hygienic. He requests one thing, he requests Listerine. And we see that he's upstairs in the room, and he goes through maybe 2 or 3 girls because there's a new girl, and he often sees the new girls as well. And then the girls also joke amongst themselves that at the end of the day, he goes home. He never comes, but he goes home and then he sleeps with his wife. And I think that's also, another instance of walking that line of stereotype that might not age well. And there's one other one. If I bring it up, it's just rather, we hear off screen that there's another customer that Dawn is to see, and Dawn says, oh, I hope it's not the Hasid. And then, meaning the Hasidic Jew, which represents, a very ultra-conservative part of Judaism. So then after she sees him, she just makes the comment of, oh, I just wish that it wasn't quite like this, and they didn't do this thing with their wives and make them shave their heads and wear wigs. And, well, it's okay because it was only half an hour since the Hasids are cheap. So not directly enforcing another stereotype, but playing, it's on the boundary. So,
however, I think what has aged very well, I think this is still something that could be depicted more or less like this, is when it comes to the new black working girl that arrives at the brothel, and then a black American customer comes in and he doesn't really look at her, as if in this place he wants to see the white girls, he wants to see the blondes, he wants to see the image that have sort of been like the images that have sort of been dispersed through media. And even here, seeing a black woman, like that is not what he expects. And I think this is so interesting. And I think this is so...
The tension in that scene was really powerful. And I do think playing with expectations, desire, and image and representation, all in this one scene, I mean, it's a thing that has now become really big just in our current discourse on race and race relations and race on race, black versus black, Asian versus Asian. I don't know. I mean, I'm reducing it by just saying that, but these sorts of things where you think of crime or just hate crime against one's own race maybe is the best way to sum it up. And just these internalized negative stereotypes or negative biases. There's a lot of tension in this moment, and I think it was a very powerful scene because it depicts something that's also currently in our understanding of race relations in terms of if you are a part of a certain ethnicity or race and then continuously perpetrating crime, or whether the crimes in a legal sense, not necessarily, but just biases or perpetrating negative stereotypes towards the same race or ethnicity or background or even religion or whatever it is. Just this internalized hatred towards one's identity marker, which is emerging as either just as a field of interest, but also something that's very difficult to navigate because it's never clean cut and often has to do with perceptions of advantage or exposure, bleeding back into really socioeconomic advantages as well as geographical ones, migration, immigration, education. It's a whole topic.
To me, of course, I'm a white man, but I'm interested in this a lot. I remember reading Teju Cole's Open City, and recurring instance in that novel is that the protagonist is often addressed as brother by other black men, and it's not clear if it is just out of blackness or if it even speaks to the immigrant experience because he's from Africa originally, like from the African continent, from Nigeria, I think. And so there is this ongoing reminder that you are still someone different and that you belong to a certain group. And I think some people don't appreciate that reminder at all. And some people want to actively combat it in some way.
I am Asian American. I look Asian, yet I was raised in America. But I was raised in America because I was adopted. And thus there are even different implications on how I also view identity. And I think it's so everything is very complex in general. Maybe not a topic for today, but perhaps we shall see other films that will explore identity, its various facets, because I think it is endlessly
to be continued.
Yeah, to be continued, and is endlessly fascinating as well.
And in the meantime, I would like you to talk on the end, because you noticed something I didn't notice when I watched the film, even though I saw it twice by now. And I think it's a very sharp detail that I missed. And so the shift ends. Molly, after taking the double shift that she was never, that she never intended to go through. Yeah. What happens at the end?
So essentially, she hands the money to her employer, Lucy. Her employer. This is, I don't even know if this is a generous way to refer to Lucy. There are many things that we didn't also get to talk about in terms of Lucy and that power structure.
Yeah, that's true. But we cannot cover everything.
Yes. And so she does that, and she cheekily asks Lucy if she's ever heard of surplus value. And then she tells her that she doesn't plan to return. And in the way that I saw it, I remember I was sort of blown away because she takes her bike and she walks off camera to the right. So this is an entrance or an exit that has never been used
Almost
before.
like into the camera, right?
Almost into the camera, and as if she's walking straight off set, which is something that we'd only recently seen in About Dry Grasses, but as if this was all in a self-contained environment. And it was also the feeling I kind of got.
Because in the background there is still the
we
door.
see the actual door that she entered in, and all the other Johns entered and exited.
Yeah, so we were never aware that there might be another door.
Yes. And I just thought that was very, very brilliant. And all along, I also had this idea that could, in some sense, be a chamber piece.
And also because the setting is so reminiscent of a sitcom setting, right? So you have the big living room from where different rooms branch off to the outside or upstairs. This is really like a sitcom. It's only lacking the laughter. It feels very stagey there in a way. But of course, in the stage, you find social realism not so much in the form, because the form is still sort of colorful, it's sort of comedic, but the actual things that you see, they are in a social realist manner, as we talked about, all the mundane sort of labor they have to do. Yeah, so this idea that this was all a stage that she now leaves, I find this very fascinating and adds something to the film.
Where does it end finally, the film?
And the film finally ends with Molly returning to her morning routine and waking up in bed next to her partner and with an eye open.
Yeah, exactly. So at first there's the freeze frame, and this is while the end credits are running. Then at the very end, almost like a post-credit scene, we see her eyes blink open and we wonder what's going on. As if she is now realizing, oh, she has quit the job, but what happens now? Yeah, how is she now going to make money? How is she now going to finance her artistic endeavors? And yeah, I think it's a very interesting ending. I think so. Of course, you have the book ending more or less of the start and the end, but makes you think, what is she going to do now? And what happened as well is that early in the film, I don't know if it is just she, but also her colleagues, they're given these business cards by the Johns. And earlier in the film, those business cards are thrown away. But at the end of the film, Molly puts it into her purse of one of the more like a kind old elderly man who asked her, as so many others, if he could see her outside the facilities. Yeah, so there's also this option open to her that she might see him again.
Yeah, and I think that the way the whole entire film presents and just ends too is that it really it's not a character study at all, but it helps us understand that in this particular situation, that this woman, Molly, ideally, and women like her, should be able to make informed decisions about their body as a means of making money, and that she does have agency in this situation, which is very much not always the case in such line of work. However, in this particular one, it's more, I think the film functions as really I haven't seen Regrouping, but all of her films sort of function in this way to consciously become talking points of alternative modes of being, of living, of interacting with our systems of money and of value and of just how just and other people and our relations with those, how to and ultimately encourages both a great individual, perhaps one can say, strives towards the individualization and agency while also maintaining respect for all of those who might be different or have different modes of or lifestyles, etc., but also in some form that allows for a version of community or solidarity to exist, so that for me, at least watching this, it seems, she's not alone, even though she is able to make her own choices, which is, I think, still and not always the case, but it's something that to see represented is somewhat empowering as what could be.
Yeah, and there's something very pragmatic about that as well, to rationalize that as a decision you may or may not make, and to decide whether giving your mind, that is something that Lizzie Borden has often said, whether you give your mind for 40 hours a week or you give your body for 8 hours a week. And maybe, some people might choose the one over the other and vice versa. And I think it's a very good point to make, right? And the film is very pragmatic in that too. There's this scene where Molly, I think, says that you will get used to it, and if you don't, maybe that's not your profession. There's something simple as that, and yeah.
And I think, I wish I knew more about this, but in terms of people who talk about anti-capitalist, in terms of anarchist, or in terms of the completely anarchist societies or modes, it's highly fascinating as well, because what sex work can enable is that you do not necessarily, like you just said, use your 40-hour work week in doing something that you do not want to be doing. Because at the end of the day, what is imperative is that you must make money, because that is what we need in order to survive. But fortunately and unfortunately, in some sense, depending on how it is that you look at it, if the body can also be used as a product to make money, this should not be criminalized. Ultimately, Lizzie Borden, I think, must see that there is an inherent rot in the system that forces people to be, to have to work in general, regardless of what the line of work is. And it just so happens that this film works to just show, this, like any other job, there are emotional burdens and ties and difficulties in performing a job, regardless of what sort of a job it is. And I don't have a solution personally, but it is also to my interest to explore what other alternatives do really exist, if any, that are ones that can be feasible to allow people to pursue the interests that they have and also survive.
I mean, that seems obvious to me would be unionization, and of course, this doesn't seem realistic at this point in time in the United States, for instance. But even back then, Lizzie Borden was affiliated with the New York, not union, but people who would be in support of organized prostitution, and the national organization of that time, to which many of these regional organizations, associations pertained, was the National Task Force on Prostitution. And when she screened this film, Working Girls, she would often have Q&As also with sex workers as well. So people in the audience could ask them as well. And I think this is a good way of just educating people on this matter.
Yeah, no, definitely. So there are...
Yeah?
Oh, no.
Sorry.
No. So there are really so many more things to talk about that I don't think we have time to do so. Very interesting. First we will talk, what is Lizzie Borden doing right now?
Yeah, maybe, what is Lizzie Borden right now? Because, of course, she's still alive and well, and she will hopefully be so for a long time. But she hasn't been part of the industry very long, because the next film she went on doing after after Working Girls. Well, she did also, well, the next film, one could say, was Inside Out. There was a film for the Playboy, I think, for the Playboy. So Inside Out, not to be confused with the Pixar film from about 10 years ago. So it's not so child friendly, I guess. But then the next big thing that she was hired to do was Love Crimes. And that was a film for Miramax, with a company with which she was then affiliated after them picking up Working Girls in Cannes. And yeah, she had a script that she found very interesting by two writers, but this turned out to be a disaster because the main actor, for instance, Sean Young, she didn't like the script at all. She hadn't read it before accepting the role. That meant that the script was changed a lot, also not only due to her, but also due to her. And so it ended up being a film that she didn't want to do, actually, that Lizzie Borden was less and less interested. But at the time, this was her first film in Hollywood, right? Because these other films are not Hollywood films. And so for a big production company, I think at the time, perhaps 6 million or so for budget, not too shabby. And yeah, she didn't know that she could just walk off, basically, but she was also sort of pressured because Harvey Weinstein at the time responded to her request of having her name dropped off or taken from the project. Like, she would still do the film, but her name would not be associated with the film. And he told her that if she did that, then she would basically, what we would now call, be canceled. That she would, yeah. And yeah, so in her own terms, I think she ended up still being sort of in film prison, as she calls it, because to many colleagues, she was now known as a complicated woman.
Yes, yeah. And I think even Weinstein has just said, well, Lizzie Borden, very difficult to work with.
Exactly, difficult. Yeah, that's the term.
I mean, I suppose it's really a compliment if you were difficult to work with Harvey Weinstein, but it's, I mean, maybe we should not say it this way, but I just mean it in...
Yeah, and Sean Young, for instance, the main actor, later went on accusing Harvey Weinstein of having, harassed her and so on. So yeah, it's a big thing that we are not going to unravel now. So, not talking too much about that. What is Lizzie Borden doing now?
Lizzie Borden currently teaches, and I believe she has been trying to get another film called Rialto made for the past over 20 years. It originally had the name Susan Sarandon associated with it. However, there were various hiccups along the way, and the film has not been in production yet.
Yeah, it's in pre-production.
It's in pre-production.
And that could pretty much mean anything.
It could mean anything, and it's allegedly, there are a few different sources, but I believe it might be a period piece based in the 1950s on a woman who runs a cinema house, who then encounters a man and is somehow later, what's the word when you're persecuted by the and then is persecuted by the
convicted?
No. And then persecuted by the Legion of Decency, because it's also going to potentially be an abortion-related film, and the Legion of Decency being a Catholic body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, apparently in the basement they conduct abortions, and upstairs they have the movie theater where they show films that the Catholic Legion doesn't want to be screened. Yeah, doesn't want to be screened.
I see. She also published a book called Whorephobia.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's interesting because there are names in there that are known to me. There is Kathy Acker, for instance, who of course has passed away long ago, but there's a story by her in there that I think was maybe published before. There's also a story by Chris Kraus, who wrote I Love Dick, for instance. The term whorephobia, I mean, that puts it well. I think there's still a lot of education that people need to put themselves through.
Yeah, to go hand in hand with the term slut shaming. So,
Oh, yeah. Exactly. So yeah, she is an editor, and she also still, or again, one should say, writes for Art Forum and other outlets.
Still maintains her interest in art criticism, and I think has long-term plans to do something on Cuban artist Ana Mendieta and other works that she'd like to realize. And
I think that brings us to an end, right? I think we would both be very much looking forward to another film.
Oh, yes. So I wanted to just thank you for choosing this. It was very interesting, very fascinating period, a lot of turmoil, a lot of, revolutionary spirits, a lot of different sorts of conversations that are happening that have really influenced our lived reality, and a lot of conversations that still need to occur because not much like the future predicted has in Born in Flames has necessarily changed in terms of perception. I think one thing to change things legally, it's another thing to change them at home. It's also, even when we have the awareness and mindset that certain things should be different, there should be more parity, it's not always the case. You have these various things in terms of domestic work that's done by women. So now there's a conscious idea that men do know that they should participate more in domestic work, but still women wind up doing more, the majority of the domestic work at home. And then other power dynamics and structures, because it's not always perhaps clean-cut man versus females. It's also who has the power and how are we replicating these power dynamics in a way that's to a disadvantage to women or to marginalized groups in general. So I wanted to keep in line with our theme of sort of doing decade, and I wanted to introduce...
Maybe, because I don't know if listeners are aware of this, but we basically, at first, without really intending it, so for each film, we picked a different decade. We have 2010s, I think, with Western, and we have Bob Fosse's All That Jazz. There was 1979. Now we have the 80s with Working Girls. And yeah, what is it going to be next time?
This time, I'm going to shovel us back into France under the occupation of the Germans, 1940s, and Marcel Carné's Les Enfants du Paradis, written by Jacques Prévert. It's a film that I revisit every 3 or 4 years, and I was very curious to revisit it with you. Quite long. We do have, actually, the presence of a sex worker, but this is barely related at all to the film that we've discussed today. And I hope that we will find many things to talk about in it, but it's more about, it's a very problematic time to be filming a film, and it's more, for me, I guess, a very beautiful story of desire and the politics around that. And so it's quite, well, you'll see.
I'm looking forward. It's a film I've never seen. Of course, I've heard a lot about it, but never got to see it, so it's a good occasion for that. And we should say at the very end here, first of all, thank you, Eliana, as well, for doing this with me. And that we are not so certain about when the next episodes are going to be published. You'll see when they hit you, but as of now, we cannot commit to a fixed schedule. It's very time-consuming to do the research on these podcasts, and we have other commitments as well. We'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, thank you again, and we look forward to making the next one.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao. Bye.